There we go. If we just run through the questions so far, and then we'll go back to the presentation.
Okay. So the first question, Hugh, was from Alice, which was, has any research been undertaken into PANDAS, which is the pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric, sorry, my screen's just moved on me, neuropsychiatric disorder associated, for example, where antibodies responding to, say, something like a strep infection attack healthy brain tissue. Has there been any research between that and risk-taking behavior?
Gosh, I don't know. That's interesting. It sounds really interesting from point of view of yeah. No, I don't know is the answer to that. And please email me about that. I can find out more about it. I work a bit with the Encephalitis Society, so they might come across questions or resources around these sort of issues where it's some kind of inflammatory response. And of course, at the moment with COVID, because COVID leads to this inflammatory response kind of problems, and I don't know whether that might be an issue, but I don't know. So thank you.
Brilliant. So then the next question was from Anna, which was, we heard this week that the government is investing £300 million in boxing as a crime prevention initiative for wayward youths. Given risk of traumatic brain injury, do you think that is likely to be counterproductive?
Well, there's a long answer and the short answer is probably it's a good thing to be investing in opportunities for socializing and sports, and it would be good if there was more friendly environments for youth to congregate and do stuff that they find that they want to do. On the boxing front, boxing does lead to, can lead to, but doesn't necessarily have to lead to brain trauma, and there's some pretty good safeguards in place in some boxing with some boxing authorities over managing the risk of concussion. So if done in a way that's safe, then it's not problematic. Problem with boxing is, of course, that if you keep it to the way in which you mark someone, as it were, for their style and grace and all the rest of it, then great. But if the upshot is to knock someone out, then that's not great. But it could be positive. I think, going for and there could be a way of also getting across, because I also work in rugby. I'm involved in quite a few initiatives there, and the way in which England Rugby did a nice job on the Don't Want to Be a Head Case program about managing risk of concussion and what to do with concussion and picking it up, and if in doubt, stay out of the game and that sort of thing. Then I think that's can be a very positive public health approach. Because sports is actually very good for your brain and the socialization. So managing the risk is the important thing.
No, that's really perfect. So then Amanda,
can we take a moment though, Simon, just to reflect on the language of wayward youths?
Oh, wayward. Yeah, wayward. Yeah, waywards. All kinds of people are wayward, aren't they? All kinds of people are
not very trauma informed.
Not very trauma informed. No.
We always see delinquency in anything that's anything American, don't we? It's always delinquent or delinquency.
Yeah,
that's language again. So Amanda, who's involved in the Southwest Reducing Reoffending Partnership, Amanda's posed a question. She said, so probation had a kind of a market warming event this week, kind of outlining their plans or aspirations around supporting neurodiversity. Good. And they're looking at sort of what their commissioning looks like moving forward, and she just wondered if there's any ideas about what a service would or should look like.
Oh, that's a fantastic question, and my answer is please get in touch separately to put me in touch with anybody that would be helpful there. There's absolutely. there needs to be the joining up of the three Ps, prison, probation, and police around community support. The Reconnect program is particularly maybe useful. The NHS Reconnect program, which is starting to get kind of put in place. That's to do with having NHS workers from prison to community. In Thames Valley, that's hopefully going to be happening. So the main point is, if you need to have that connectivity between whoever is supporting someone going from a criminal justice kind of part into the community part, and making sure that data to support the person is there, and also that there's appropriate handover and support. And when it comes to brain trauma, which I'll come to in a minute, it's absolutely vital that there's sharing of information to support somebody, not necessarily around risk of crime, because probation obviously has to be thinking about risk, but also about support needs. And actually that will be very much part of what I'll come to next.
Perfect. So open invite to Amanda to get in contact.
Please do, absolutely. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment around what good looks like in that sort of area. So please do, yeah.
Perfect. So then the next question was from Davinia, which was, can lack of sleep lead the brain to split, as in stretch the connections to a point of breakage?
Now there's a very long answer to that, and a short one. I don't think that a lack of sleep per se has those sort of effects. The reasons why someone has poor sleep are important, but sleep has a function, and sleep has a function to do with down-regulating synaptic activities. That's the connections across the brain, so you get to resting state. So your frontal parts of your brain are effectively in a bit of dimmer mode, when you're asleep. So you haven't got the frontal executive thinking, but you do have your temporal lobes and your parietal system and your limbic system active. And part of why sleep is important is that you get rid of the buildup of debris from the processes the brain's been going through in the day. So your brain's using 20% of your available oxygen in the day, or at all times, oxygenation, and it's turning energy into fuel, into waste, and to get rid of that waste is important, because then otherwise the buildup of protein waste in the brain isn't good. So when you're asleep, there's the cerebrospinal fluid and so on is kind of washing away the debris kind of from the brain. So it is important to have good sleep, both for cognitive function, because that helps with memories being formed and consolidated, but also for general homeostasis. So sleep is important. But it's over a long period of time that sleep can have a detrimental effect on brain functions. So sleep is something to, and if you're more on that, certainly can point in some directions around sleep management. But sleep's interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And let's say probably a very complex area, but
well answered. And often disturbed especially a trauma-informed approach is also making sure that people work with people who've been traumatized have a good system of support around them, so they don't have trouble with sleep, which then leads to overthinking and over worrying about things, and then turns into poor sleep. So I think I would I'm hopefully doing some work with negotiators and so on soon, and a big thing keeps coming up is sleep, because you're left with a lot of worry. People front line, a lot of worry, and that worry turns into sleep problems, and sleep problems then turns into so it's more on that sort of level. But anyway, yes, and if there's a toolkit for trauma support, sleep should be part of that, because trauma disrupts sleep because you've got all the intrusive stuff happening.
And then I guess, it just coming to mind is, professionals or people who support people with trauma, who work shift work, etc. So really
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and then Susan raised a really good question, which was so she completed some previous training around fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and it was referred to in the training as a brain injury that was not recoverable. She just wondered about your thoughts around this, because it's a trauma to the brain, but not through a lack of consciousness. It's a different type of
Yeah,
traumatic brain injury.
it's a different kind of injury. So in fetal alcohol type syndromes, one of the key things the brain's not forming in the way that it would have formed. The myelination processes and everything else is different. So you don't get in your normal brain you have neurotypical brain, you have all those nice little sulci and gyri. So that's all the grooves and grooves and grooves, and all those grooves are important because that's more surface area for the cerebrospinal fluid to get in and around. That's why we have those lovely grooves in the brain, and that surface area is your grey matter, and that grey matter is where all the connections are being made. That's where the outer layer of the cortex. The outer layer is your association cortex. The outer layer is maybe up to a centimeter thick, or less. But that outer layer really needs that to be sort of looked after by the cerebrospinal fluid, supply and demand. So in fetal alcohol syndrome, you have a smooth brain surface in more severe cases. So basically, the amount of brain area that for association cortex is much less, which is incredibly sad. And so it is a form of brain insult, which is non-traumatic, but it's pre-birth. Yeah. But then there's but what do you do? I mean, I think there's something really interesting to be done around the how to access neuroplasticity of brains. Maybe going back to that in discussion. What a big area I think is how we can improve brain functions. If you can, what can we do to try to engage and enable brain systems that are there, that we can as much as possible, but also how can we compensate for something that's never really going to necessarily mechanically recover, so but how can we compensate for that? I'll come to a little bit of that actually towards the end, if you like.
And that might actually also tie into the next question, which was the last question for the moment, which was from Debbie, which was, so how much of an issue is misdiagnosis? For example, without brain injury screening, how do we know if a child has had a traumatic injury or if they have autism, etc.? Given that many of the responses and consequences overlap, I've got a feeling you might come to some of this in a minute. But the question really is, would the supportive interventions for the child look different if the difficulties were actually aligned to a result of a brain injury?
Fantastic question, thank you. Yes, so I think my thinking on this is there's just a massive level of misdiagnosis or lack of diagnosis in general. So it's a diagnosis by default, especially school exclusion, which I'll come to. It's not fitting in, so your behaviour becomes the thing that gets kind of picked up on, and that behaviour is not really properly understood. And sorry, I need to watch my language, but how the heck can a teacher who's pressed to try to teach in a certain kind of way, how are they supposed to enable diagnosis, and how are educational psychologists supposed to kind of do all this when the waiting list and all this times? And it's very difficult. We do need to have, there's a SEND review happening at the moment. There's a review of we say a SEND review is the SEND review, isn't it? And it doesn't talk about many at all neuro disability issues. It's awful. It's awful. There's a complete lack of understanding. It's of the demands on educationalists from a point of view of not diagnosed, not going to be diagnosed conditions, which then leads to problems, and then lack of support, and then problems in school. And so that's the short version. I'll actually be talking more about that in a minute. In terms of interventions, absolutely right. There are kind of, to some extent, there's uniform interventions to do with let's slow down. Let's think about what we need to remember. Let's think about how to manage one's feelings. Let's think about, are we paying attention? Let's think about these things. But then there might be some things that might be very condition type specific. So in autism spectrum, there might be some issues. Or in a brain injury, it's going to be more impulsive, dysexecutive, and but there's lots of overlaps with ADHD. But the end result is that often it's things like having someone who kind of goes, are you understanding what's going on? Okay. Are you going to be able to do that? So next week, shall we text you to make sure you're there at the interview for that you need to be aware of. It's that sort of having, there's a nice study in the Netherlands that was happening before COVID and hope is still happening, showing that having a bit of a life coach that's within your reference group for kids like this is actually very effective. It's really good. Of course, it is if you can, model and support. Anyway, so shall I? And so some of the answers are in what I'm going to talk about next.
No, definitely. I mean, more questions will undoubtedly come in, but I think that was the ones for the moment. So yeah, if you over to you, floor's yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, right. So the links between brain injury and crime. So one of the and this speaks to what some of you've been asking about actually. So I was talking about how kids from more deprived backgrounds are more likely to have brain injuries for whatever reasons we can imagine, lack of opportunities, lack of safe play areas, demands, etc. So there's a nice study, it's a birth cohort study in New Zealand, in Christchurch, looking at, God knows, I think it's about 7,000 kids, so tracking them over a long period of time. And if there's a brain injury at age 5, and this is a brain injury where you go to hospital, you get looked at, and they kind of go, oh, keep you in for observations, maybe not, and you're home. So mild, but with a kid around 5, you do want to make sure that there's no swelling or hemorrhaging and so on. So it's that sort of decision making. So anyway, so back home, they're fine. The first few months after back in school, they're the same as the other kids. Within 2 years, by the time they're 7 or 8, they are nearly twice as likely to have problems in paying attention and concentrating in the classroom. By the time they're 11 or 12, they're nearly twice as likely to be excluded from school. And by the time they're 15, they're twice as likely or more to be in contact with the law for vandalism, and maybe more petty stuff and reactive stuff. But so you can see there's a bit of a trend there. But back to the question, something a bit earlier, a little bit more preventative work earlier might be really good about reducing that trajectory. And at this point, I tend to think, my God, I mean, how much does it cost to send someone to a young offender unit for one night? About 600 quid. How much does it cost to have a teaching assistant in a classroom? Well, it's not going to be, it's the economics start to be, interesting. So over here, so that's one set of studies, cohort studies that are indicating increased risk of problems, and you can link that back to the American study I mentioned earlier with increased risks in general. So the study on the right there is a study in Sweden. So this is from Sina Fassell, who looked at the data sets that across Sweden for 35 years, all Swedes. So 2.5% of Swedes become violent offenders at some point in their lives. If in their health records there's a brain injury, then 9% of them become violent offenders. So 2 people in 100 without brain injury, and 9 people in 100 with a brain injury become violent offenders. So that lots of people with a brain injury don't become violent offenders, but unfortunately there's an increased risk. What Sina also did is looked at the risk for the siblings of the brain injured offenders and found they were at an elevated level of risk too, but that was 4.5%. So basically, a brain injury triples your risk for violent crime if there aren't other criminogenic risk factors, as it were. But doubles your risk if there's these other factors, lack of opportunities, maybe, genetics and family issues and so on. So that's a standout important study from Sina Fassell. Very recently, there's actually I'll jump to this study. The very recent paper from Denmark, just published a month or 2 ago. I was lucky enough to review it, and I think it's fantastic. This is a study in all Danes, so 7 million people over about 25-30 years, and they looked at 6 databases to look at trends in what happens after people have a head injury. And the standout message here was that if there's a brain injury in someone's life, then they're nearly 3 times more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. And they're also nearly 3 times as likely to kill themselves. so suicidality. So so brain injury leads to these changes in your life and your ability to cope with life and what's going on. It gives you so many obstacles and difficulties. And one interesting thing they did all interesting analyses, but one thing was that I mentioned earlier that within the first few weeks or months of a brain injury, there'll be these sort of neuropsychiatric problems of, nausea, fatigue, headaches, all kinds of stuff, as well as impulsivity and stuff. But if you pick up on those issues relatively early, these researchers were saying we can probably reduce 1 in 8 suicides and 1 in 12 violent crimes in Denmark. So that's your total population type sort of studies in Denmark. So that's the broad picture from point of view of the epidemiology. So it's increased risk. But one of our early studies in this area was about 10 years ago, looking at adults in prison, and we asked adults in prison, men in prison, have you had a head injury? Were you knocked out for a period of time? How long for? How old were you at the time? How young were you when you came into prison for the first time, went to incarcerated in some way, what have you? And so we found, compared to 10% of the general population who've had a brain injury at some point, of which, if you think of it this way, that 2 people in 100 have had a moderate severe brain injury, 8 people in 100 have had a mild brain injury. Okay, so 2 in 100, very consequential brain injury, 8 in 100, possible in long term. In the people in prison, 17% had moderate severe brain injury, so nearly 2 in 10, and about 50% had mild brain injuries. So the rate is just much higher for all the severities of brain trauma. So more than 60% have had some kind of brain injury. Importantly, younger at age of first imprisonment, 16 versus 21 for those with brain injury history. So it's something about the developmental trajectory. So even if it's not a key factor in crime, it's an indicator that stuff is not good for this person's life. When we looked at young people now in a YOI, we had about 200 in this study, and 16 years of age. 65% had a head injury history, 45% had knockout history, 17% had moderate to severe brain injury. And again, adolescents are more likely to have long-range problems after a milder brain injury. Now, plasticity is great in developing brain, but the problem is it's the way in which the connectivity gets impacted on by brain injury because it's diffuse. So that's problematic. This is Gire, who was my trainee who did this study. It was great. So so the problem then is that there's a lot of brain trauma in the population. What do you do about it? I mean, oh God, if you're assessing every for brain injury, what are you going to do the rest of the time? But what you need to do is figure out, well, who's had the moderate severe injury, the 1 or 2 in 10, and does a mild injury impact on the ability that somebody is, engaging in your treatment program? So they'll be maybe not good at concentrating, paying attention, more impulsive, maybe not that good on focus. So you just think about that as something to just generally manage. When you look at women who've ended in prison, and we've done a number of studies by now, and alongside some of our colleagues. So this is some of the headlines from those studies. So 65% or so of women in prison have a brain injury, and many of these injuries would have happened before their first offence. So 33% sustained their injury prior to first offence. And it's just really quite striking from a trauma-informed way of working. 62% of women had sustained their brain injury through domestic violence. In this study, there's one woman that was remarkable. As an example, less than 5% knew they had had a brain injury, although more than 60% had the brain injury, right? And because they don't think of it necessarily in that kind of way. So one being asked, have you had a head injury? Well, I don't know. Well, what do you mean? Well, have you been knocked out for a period of time? Oh, yeah. So when's the last one? When's the worst one? Oh, there was one where I came to and I looked at myself in the mirror and I couldn't see my own face because it's so swollen. So that's an indicator there's a hell of a lot of brain trauma in the context of intimate partner violence. And if you look at the histories of these people, you're thinking, well, we need this it's more supportive care systems, isn't it? Really. And I'm trying to kind of keep this a bit brief, but some of the headlines from the work, been working with a Do It Profiler, which is a way of screening for common neurodisabilities quite quickly using a computerized screening system. So it's quite neat. Anyway, so what you tend to find in women in prison, and there's about 3,400 women in prison at the moment in the UK, they tend to have problems in attention, concentration, and social communication. So over here, this is the sort of over here. This is the rote problems over here. And the ones with more of these problems, let's just, for the sake of argument, say that, let's say 50% of women in prison have no or mild neurodisability, and then another 50% have some, of which half of them have a number of issues like ADHD meets brain injury meets a little bit of communication problems, right? So just think of it that way, constellation of needs. Often social communication issues, not following what's being said, not following, reading the room and so on. The more of those issues, the comparison we had on suicide was interesting. So the ones with no no neurodisability issues, 15% had tried to kill themselves. The ones with multiple neurodisabilities, 75% had tried to kill themselves. So they were incredibly troubled and needing of support. Here's another study in this sort of set with my colleague Tom McMillan, who I work with in Glasgow. He did a study of Scottish prisons women. So 78% of women in prison had brain injury, 40% with associated disability. They have ongoing issues from their brain injuries. And in most cases, this was from domestic abuse. So it is, history of abuse, problem substance use, and current post-traumatic stress disorder in the mix. We used to think that people with brain injury don't have PTSD because to have PTSD, you're supposed to have memories of what happened, and then that's going to bubble up. Well, that's nonsense. We did some work with Tom actually showing that people with brain injury are more likely to have PTSD because they can't remember what happened. They remember something happened and not quite sure what happened. And they have sense memories, smell memories and all the rest of it. So really important to try to figure out the PTSD angle in here. There's increasing studies now in similar to Tom and mine and Amanda Kirby's and Disability Trust in the UK in America, showing that women in prison have substantial levels of brain injury. This is in New Mexico and the major depression, PTSD, much higher in the women in prison compared to men in prison as well. So one part of that then is, there's brain injury, they're reporting brain injury, and one of the things that you tend to get is they might be saying they've got brain injury, aren't they? But what about any real, scan evidence? Well, the German literature is interesting because in Germany, you seem to be able to get a scan very quickly if you've got medical complaints in prison. So there's a huge amount of data on CT scans, MRI scans, clinical data in Germany, and a group there has been looking at those scans, and what they find is that compared to non-offenders, people in prison have many more anomalies or lesions in their brains, and the people who are violent offenders have lesions, particularly in their frontal lobes. So that's really quite important kind of work emerging, showing that there are lesions, especially in the frontal lobes. And I'd be thinking, oh gosh, you can't plan, organize, and you can't manage your impulsivity, right? So the summary here is that people with brain injury will have problems in engaging in treatment, greater levels of infraction, more reconviction, often in the areas of violence, and there's links, especially in women who end up in the criminal justice with PTSD and domestic violence, PTSD being a key thing that is quite corrosive. One When we looked at young people in YOIs, as mentioned, we have find a high level of brain trauma, and so we've helped set up the CHAT, the comprehensive health assessment tool for young people coming into the YOIs. In one study of that, we had interestingly 82% had a brain injury, and about 40% had ongoing symptoms from the brain injury. And this is a quick summary, but basically those with ongoing symptoms versus those without much in the way of any ongoing symptoms, that you got a bit higher self-harm, 57% versus 43. Suicide, again, greater, 50% of suicidal is 24%, and being in care, 64% have been in care compared to 34. So the brain injury is something that's often come up with ADHD. Being in care, more likely to be suicidal and more risk going on, more trauma. So this is, again, think about the links to being trauma informed. And it's so interesting is what you can do. I mean, this is from Amanda Kirby, where she was talking about how there's a missing of these neurodisabilities in school systems. So schools don't get supported to support these kids effectively. If you look at kids in YOIs, another set of shared studies, 4/5 reported leaving education before 16 or at 16, and many have been in care. And when there's ADHD as the particular neurodisability, then treating the ADHD is associated with reduced substance use, misuse, improved housing status, increased employment. So it comes back to Beccari, when I mentioned earlier that there's a solution here. There's a solution. Pick up on these issues and provide either general support or specific support tailored to the underlying neurodisability they have. Oh gosh. So you may be thinking, you mentioned, care background and so on. The kids who are the crossover kids, it's so often there's a lack of diagnosed brain trauma, but increasingly in Canada, in Australia, that there's awareness now of assessing for brain injury and using things like the cognitive tasks, like it's called the SART, ability to pay attention effectively. And effectively what you have is these are kids who will stray from intended goals and make errors because of an underlying brain injury. These are the crossover kids. Other work as well in showing the earlier undiagnosed neurodisability being linked to problems in school and then school exclusion. This is one particularly good study, I think, Cosimano and colleagues, showing how in foster care kids, 65% had a brain injury, and high likelihood of TBI was linked to higher levels of drug use and aggression. Now, think about foster participants with 65% brain injury. What was the background of the foster kids? Why did they need to be taken into foster care? What kind of trauma history was there? What did that lead to in terms of the need for drugs to cope with what's going on and so on? So there's a need to get in there and do some formulation around trauma. This is again added to by some other work we've done. If you look at kids in YOIs, and in this study we looked at parenting that these kids had, and the kids who said that nobody was there to make sure they were home, nobody was there to make sure they did what they're supposed to do, nobody asked them about their day and so on. So the more on the neglectful end of parenting, then it was more likely that these young people had a head injury with a loss of consciousness, and that was more likely associated with reactive aggression, so reacting badly to being wound up by somebody else, wherever it is, right? So there's an intervention there, supporting the parents of kids where there's problems around being able to engage. Another study we did looked at young people in a YOI, and this data, quite complex modeling data, but effectively the kids who'd had a head injury were more likely to have had school exclusion early, and that school exclusion was more likely then to be linked to ending up in criminal justice. But of course, this is the ongoing problem, and talking to Stan, and he's the violence reduction unit commander in Tertali. So it's so much about how the drug the predatory crime groups are so good at getting in there when someone's vulnerable and nobody else has their eye on the ball. They're in there, they get hold of them, and they use them. That's it. It's awful. So this is the kind of a little bit more about this area, should you want, in the PowerPoint. Basically, that there's a lot of overlap in these crossover kids, and brain injury is a very common issue. But one of the problems is that these young people often think that this is normal, this is normality. It isn't. She was over at this guy's house and the usual thing happened, tried to rape her and shit, it's no big deal though. It is. But you're normalizing stuff that shouldn't be normalized. And so the trauma-informed piece there is incredibly important, isn't it? It's a book which just come out, actually, that Hope Kent, my wonderful PhD student, helped me with James on in this area. So anyway, we're coming to a close now to try to summarize some of the stuff that's kind of going on. So the UN ran or supported the study, and then is reacting to a study that we were part of on how many kids worldwide are detained, and what are their issues. And there's about 8 million at this incredibly conservative estimate. This is the first study. So there's work happening through UNICEF to try to address the issues of kids who are detained for whatever matter within prisons, refugee centres and orphanages and various places. And very common in these populations, there would be some form of neurodisability. And imagine the refugee kid from Syria, the barrel bombs, the trauma of being abducted and used as a child soldier and that sort of thing, horrendous levels of these sort of issues. So that's got one big picture thing in UN. And another big picture thing in UN-wise is that there's more attention now coming towards neurodisability, but also towards what is the legal solutions, hopefully, to some of these. Well, the UN recently brought out a change to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in the Justice section to effectively say there's far too many kids with neurodisability ending up in our criminal justice systems. Their needs need to be addressed and assessed so that they will spend less time in our justice systems and be supported more effectively. But more needs to be done by all our member states, 887 of them, to do more to reduce the chances of children with a neurodisability ending up in our criminal justice settings. That's and what can be done. There's a range of options, I mean, from the judicial through to the educational and all the rest of it. It's about inclusion and deflection. Inclusive policies, school-based inclusive policies, the outreach and in-reach and all those systems, the stuff that you guys are doing left, right and centre, I'm sure. So it's great. Kind of having trauma-informed ways of working across agencies is fantastically important. This guy over here is Judge Beecroft. He was the lead judge for kids in New Zealand. He saw our data on how many kids in custody have neuro disabilities, and so they changed the system there to assess screen for neurodisability before they come into court, and then think about, well, is this going to be the fix, or shall we do more restorative justice in the community approach tailored towards if you're Maori or if you're Pākehā, etc. So more sensitive sort of deflect and into community type approaches. In New Zealand, and this is the project we're hopefully going to be running in Plymouth soon. We're going my colleagues have developed a screening tool to help the decision makers to be able to in courts, pre-courts, police, to be able to go, there may be a neurodisability here, so we need to take a different approach. So that's now being rolled up in New Zealand to 18 to 25-year-olds. So it's quite neat, really, because they found it so helpful. So that's one thing. So screening, inclusive policies, the education piece is massive, isn't it? So how can we so many kids are excluded, permanently excluded. Autism spectrum disorder is a big issue in that, but then maybe up to 10%. But then the others, this nice, horrible data, nice study, horrible data from Amanda and Hope and I coming out soon that we can refer you to. But basically the levels of brain trauma in kids in pupil referral units, it's not good effectively. So we need to be thinking more about how can we have really inclusive policies at school level, but the right supports in there too. And this is on the trauma-informed theme. The changes happening in the YOIs in the UK, you know, it's quite difficult, isn't it? But Howard Jasper is one of my colleagues working on the Secure Stairs programme, which tries to bring together a trauma-informed way of working with a neurodisability way of working, so there's more therapeutic support given to young people who end up in the system. Of course, you know, there's challenges with that, but one of the key things in trauma-informed way is supporting the staff to be able to understand what's going on and also manage their own trauma, because, you know, you're dealing with a lot of stuff that's actually quite very well, it's all to manage, isn't it, emotionally? So this is then a bit of a summary. People in the criminal justice system are not sometimes with neurodisability and with trauma. They're mostly with neurodisability and trauma. It's not a specialist population. It is the population. It's your population. So staff in these environments need to be validated and valued for having the qualities, the qualifications, and the skills to support these people in a meaningful way to provide rehabilitation. The nature of the rehabilitation needs to take account of the cognitive and emotional consequences of brain trauma and other neurodisabilities, tailoring your approach appropriately, screening and deflect and divert, divert, community orders, all the rest of it. We need to improve our social re-entry programs. I mentioned NHS Reconnect, and we need to find ways in which there's proper, good, multi-agency ways of working. Not about, you know, kind of blame shifting, but properly co-working. And otherwise, the problem is that the solutions are, you know, by default judicial, back to Beccaria. You don't want the criminal justice system to be the system that deals with your, you know, neurodisabled young people. There were some questions around what's good for brains and brain development and so on. A completely different area. Just as I finish, a nice study in Scandinavia, in Sweden, showing that after strokes, after people have had a stroke in their mid to late life, if you provide people with music therapy twice a week for a few weeks, then you get more brain activation and you get more return of function in people through music therapy. So what does that mean? Well, there's still plasticity in older brains to be able to reorganize if you have the right inputs. What does that mean for young people? What does a young brain need? A young brain needs to be in society, to be with supportive, like-aged and kids. They need to be learning and understanding. The brain is a social organ, and play is incredibly important. Play is training for the unexpected. Lev Vygotsky, one of my favorite historical psychologists, in play, a child always behaves beyond his or her age, above his daily behavior. In play, it is as though he were or she a head taller than himself or herself. You know, we need to be thinking about how do we enable curiosity and playfulness, because that's good for brain development. I can go into that at some point, but that's it for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll just turn off the share screen. That's working.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Hugh. That's been wonderful. I'm going to stop the recording now. We've just got just over 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes for people to ask some